So here we are, part 2 of our 2-part pre-recorded lecture for day 2 on our online residential school. I'll be telling you more about how to access resources to set up and record your Zoom interview and tell you more about the things to write in your reflective piece. The third component of the assessment is something we'll also talk about, a third component for assessment 1, and I'll guide you through that and through the group work we're going to be doing in the morning session for day 2. If all that made sense? We're going to cram a lot in, but it's not going to be that long, I promise you. So you'll conduct and record your online interview in Zoom, and I have a web page resource on our Moodle page. Again, it's under Assessment 1 Resources in the Assessment tab that tells you how to record and how to let your interviewee record as well. Because when you set up a Zoom meeting, you've got to give permission for you are the host. When you set it up, the person you're inviting doesn't have recording rights, but you need to grant them to them. And you can do it, it's fairly easy, so don't panic. So that you can both record your interviews. Okay, you'll also need to set the Zoom meeting up in a way that makes sure that you're on screen and your interviewee is on screen, that you're both visible. So I can see you both at the same time. How to do that is you take it out of conferencing mode, which is where whoever speaks is on screen and only they are on screen, and you put it into gallery mode, which is the view where you don't just see the active speaker. Basically, you avoid the active speaker mode. Okay. Again, there are resources on our Moodle site to guide you through that, how to do that. It's not that complicated. It's quite easy. Don't panic. It's all, have a read of the document, the webpage I've linked to on our Moodle site under Assessment 1 Resources. Now, make sure you look at your marking rubric when you draw up your interview guide and when you conduct your interview and when you edit the video recording of your interview and when you write up your reflections on the interview. Keep a really close eye on that marking rubric because it will direct you as to how to pick up the most marks. The rubric is different from last year in that I've removed the criteria that evaluated your ability to record good audio. I mentioned that in part 1. That doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about your audio. I know I went on about that again in part 1, but it's really important. You need to do everything you can to ensure that the audio is good enough for me to hear it. Bear in mind that when you listen back to it, you probably remember what you were saying. So the audio will sound clear to you because you can fill in the gaps for anything that is unclear because you still remember what you said. But to me, I wasn't there. So if a word or two is unclear, I just won't be able to hear it. So be careful. Make sure you can hear your audio. Try it out on a friend or family member saying, is the audio okay on this? And that's one way of doing it. Of course, the other way of doing it is that a complicated way of doing it, which is all about the audio levels. But if you're into that, love the techie side of that, do it that way. I keep going on and on about this in the last video and this video because if I can't understand what you're saying, I can't award you marks. You know? And I want to give you marks. You know? It's important you pass this assessment, you know, because it's you're required to pass it, to pass the unit. But don't worry, most people do well. It's okay. Don't panic. Now, on to the third part of your submission, the written reflection. This should be no more than 500 words, and that's a 500-word limit. If you write 501 words, I won't read that last word. And have a look at the Psychology Word Count information document for rationale for why we use word limit restrictions in this way. So, what do you write? Well, it's a personal reflection, so there are no strict rules. I've provided an example of an exceptionally well-written personal reflection on our Moodle site under the Assessment tab. It's in that section on Assessment 1. But don't use that example as your template because you are not that student. The student who wrote that is not you. You know, you are you. You also weren't in that interview, so you don't have that same source material to reflect on. You know, you're not in their head. You're in your head. Okay? I'm sure it's a lovely place to be. You're in your head. So be careful when you look at examples of other people's reflective writing because they aren't you. So be you. Don't be them. Okay, but there is something I can provide you with to help you, which is some guidelines on what you should be focusing in on with your personal reflection. Now, the main focus should be you reflecting on how well your interview went in relation to whether your questions gave you rich, in-depth data to answer your research question. If it did, why did it? If it didn't, why didn't it? It might be a mix here. Some bits worked, other bits didn't work. So reflect on what helped and what hindered. And here you can think about your introduction. Did it set your interviewee at ease? How about the wording of your questions? Were they open, non-leading, short and clear, emphatic? How about the structure of your questions? Did you begin with more open, less personal questions? Did the sequencing of the questions make sense? How about your listening skills? How was your posture, your gaze, your attention? What distracted you from listening? What helped you listen? How well did you listen? And how well did you show that you were listening, through your responses? In respect to your responsive skills, how well were you able to adapt your language, your questions, the structure of the questions to the participant's account? What helped and hindered that? Did the participant seem comfortable? What skills did you use to help elicit a rich, detailed account in the participant's own words? How did you manage responding as a researcher? Were there any thoughts or feelings that arose that made things difficult? Lots of questions there. But there's lots you can write about. Okay, 500 words, quite short. But it just gives you examples of things you can focus on. You don't have to focus on all of that, by the way, but it'll give you enough questions that you'll know what content to include in your personal reflective piece. And by the way, you won't lose marks in this reflective section if you discuss your mistakes in the interview. Unlike in the interview guide, where I want to see your best questions, and unlike in the video edit, where I want to see your best bits, in the reflection, it's okay to highlight your mistakes, because actually it's a really good thing to do, because in doing so, you can produce some thoughtful and useful reflections and show what you're learning. And, that's why we're here, to learn. And so if I can see your process of learning in your reflective writing, that's great. You'll get some marks there. Okay, now let's talk about what will happen in our live session on day 2 of our online residential. So I'm going to put you into small groups, and I want you to talk to each other about possible interview questions and try those questions out on each other and give each other feedback on whether those questions work well or not. Now remember what you learned from day 1 about what's a good interview question. Remember that, and don't forget that one measure of that is whether it provides you with data that helps answer your research question. People sometimes forget about that. Also, try out your small talk. The small talk at the start of the interview. Practice that. See how that works. Does that work well? Does that put someone at ease, or is it just awkward? So you should be using this time in the live session in your small group when you're talking to your classmates. Use that time to role play your interview. You're starting to developing your guide, starting to come up with some questions in that session, and start role playing it, trying those questions out, trying that introduction out. And so you can figure out what works, what to use, what not to use. And you can use that experience to then finalize the drafting of your guide, interview guide. And again, you can have a look at that example that I provided under Assessment 1 on our Moodle site. Also, again, keep your eye on that marking rubric, which is up on the Moodle site in that section. I know I go on and on and on about the marking rubric, but it's really, really important. Students who lose sight of the marking rubric often miss out on marks. And so when they lose focus on the marking rubric, they can produce a lovely piece of work, but they don't get marks because I can only give you marks for the things I've identified in the rubric. Now, you've got a decent chunk of time for that role playing and feedback task, and you may be actually be able to write a complete draft of your interview guide in that time. If you don't have the time to get a complete draft of your interview guide, don't worry. Remember, you've got until week 6 or week 7 to get your draft written. And remember, that draft I don't necessarily see. It doesn't have to be that polished. You only really have to provide the polished version, the one that's less scrappy looking, by the time you submit for Assessment 1, which is that exam review week. So for that morning task, you'll be in a small group in a Zoom meeting till about 12 o'clock, and I'll be around, and you can invite me into your group, because I'll just be hanging around in Zoom if your group needs some help or advice. But just be prepared to wait for a bit, because I might be in another room helping another group. So, keep chatting in your group till I get there. All you got to do is just send me a message saying, Paul, can you come into our group? Or send someone over to me. Anyway, well, I'll explain how to do it. We'll figure it out on the day. But if you want me to pop into your group to help you out, I'll be able to help you out. But yeah, be patient. And I promise you, it's not because I've gone off for a cup of tea. It's just I'm in another group helping them. Okay, the reason why I'm putting you into those small groups is because peer feedback is really useful in this process of developing and testing out your interview guide. Now, when you're giving feedback to others in your group, be nice, be constructive. Most of us are likely to be feeling a bit insecure at this stage about interviewing, if it's something we haven't done before. Focus on what people are doing well. But after you do that, don't shy away from pointing out the things that they weren't doing so good. What didn't work. And you need to tell people that to give them a chance of picking up more marks in their assignment, of getting some really good questions and a really good interview guide. Now, remember, we're all learning here, so we're bound to get things wrong now and again, and that's okay. We learn from our mistakes. So when you're giving feedback to each other, these are some things that could be useful, just to give you some things that could help when you're giving feedback to your classmate. How well did the introduction go? The bit at the start. Did the introduction convey the purpose of the research? Did it give a good outline for the interview? And did it make the interviewee feel appreciated? You can ask, how was the wording of the questions? Was it open, non-leading, short and clear, emphatic? Did the sequence of questions have a logical and useful flow? How was the interviewer's posture, gaze and attention? How responsive did the interviewer appear? And ask the interviewee how it felt being interviewed. Okay, so those are the sort of questions you can think about when you're giving feedback to your classmates in that role-playing group work that we'll be doing. Okay, that's the last bit of my lecture, pre-recordings for our residential. So, I'll see you in the residential. Looking forward to it. Ta-da! Oh, by the way, if you're watching this during the residential, that sounded a little odd, didn't it? So I should say, see you in a bit. You know what I mean? Okay.